Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me down the back there? I can't actually really see you too well with this light, but yeah, all good. How's everyone feeling this morning? Any hangovers from last night? Few. I'll take the laughter as a yes. I'm still not feeling super great after the boat one the night before, but I do have an emergency exit if I need it. I'll be able to just kill the sound first. So welcome to Cognitive Biases in Software Development. For the last 60 or 70 years, researchers in social psychology and behavioral economics have identified over 200 cognitive biases that affect our ways of thinking. And I've been working in software development for nearly 20 years, which is why I have such a long beard. And I've worked with hundreds of teams, and I've seen them make the same mistakes over and over and over again. And I firmly believe that those cognitive biases are the underlying mechanism that causes a lot of these mistakes. And that's what I'm hoping to kind of share with you today. So my contact details are on the bottom there. If you don't feel comfortable putting your hand up and asking a question in a room full of people, feel free to email me or message me on Twitter. My DMs are open for now. So you can message me there. I won't identify you, but I will answer the question at the end if we have time. Otherwise, I'll reply to you separately. If you are comfortable asking a question, please feel free to put your hand up at any time, and if I can see you, I will call you out. So to explore these cognitive biases, I want to use this very pretty thing. So this is the Cognitive Bias Codex, and it was created by a person called Buster Benson, who is a marketing manager with Slack, with the help of an illustrator to make it look very nice. And he deduplicated those 200-odd cognitive biases into, I'm told there's about 188 there, I haven't counted them, and he kind of categorized them and grouped them into 4 larger areas. Now, you're definitely not going to be able to read that from the back, but we'll go through kind of each of these areas and use that to explore. And Buster said that all 4 of these areas, he called them conundrums or problems. They all affect or limit our intelligence in certain ways, but they're actually trying to be helpful in what they're doing. And every one of these cognitive biases is actually there for a reason. Usually it's to save our brain energy in terms of how it processes information. But unfortunately, the end result of a lot of these mental shortcuts, which are often useful, they also introduce errors into our thinking. And that's what cognitive biases really are. And Buster was quite hopeful. He hoped that by creating this and sharing it, it's available on Wikimedia, that people will become aware or more aware of how our minds work, how we make decisions, and that we could be a bit more mindful about the inheritance of these inaccuracies and fallacies. And hopefully that we'd act with more fairness and grace to each other. So we wouldn't think of each other as being kind of stupid for having fallen into some of these fallacies. And I'd echo that sentiment as well. I hope that I can share some of that with you today. So we're going to zoom in a bit onto the first area, which is around kind of too much information. And as you can see there, if you can read the kind of outer ring, this generally kind of, or the cognitive biases that come about here are generally around where we have problems absorbing too much information. Our brains never evolved for the internet. We're not really prepared for it. So we have to do a lot of trickery to be able to deal with the amount of information that we take in. And some of the things that happen because of that are that we notice things already primed in memory or repeated often. So things that are familiar to us will kind of come to our memory first. Bizarre, funny, or visually striking things will stick out more than non-bizarre or funny things. You remember jokes in a talk, hopefully. We notice when something has changed, and we don't notice we notice when something has changed. And that kind of change is important for us to be able to actually realize that it's there. We are drawn to details that confirm our own existing beliefs. I'm sure we've all experienced that at some time or another. The last one, though, is we notice flaws in others. And I'm sure we've all noticed the previous one in other people a lot more than we've noticed it in ourselves as well. So we're going to jump into the first cognitive bias that I'd like to talk about, which is called anchoring. Now, anchoring arises from a heuristic, a very common heuristic that we have. When we're making an estimate about something, we will tend to start an initial point, which we call an anchor, and we'll then adjust around that. And that heuristic isn't good or bad, it's just a heuristic. Where the bias comes into it is that we then tend to stick too close to the anchor. To give you a real-world example of this, if you've ever bought a used car, you've probably been subject to this bias. The sticker price that they put on the car is that initial anchoring point. So once you've become interested in it and are bargaining with the salesperson around the price, they know that you are then very likely to anchor onto that price and adjust around it. Now, they know you're probably going to adjust down unless you're a terrible negotiator. So for them, the kind of win of it is that you're unlikely to adjust down too far. So they set that price knowing that you'll want a 5–10% discount, and if they give that to you, you'll be happy. They'll be happy because they still make a considerable profit. So where we see this in software development a lot is in estimation and forecasting. For most teams who are, when it comes to estimation, they will take a task. Someone will kind of maybe read it out loud to the rest of the team and then say, I think this will take 2 weeks. So what's happened there is they've immediately anchored the discussion of that task. A common strategy that people use, and agile teams in particular use, is a technique called planning poker, which takes away a lot of that bias, and that can help in debiasing it. But it is also quite common for people to be able to anchor with less kind of direct language. Even just by talking about a task and saying this looks like it's just a small UI change or it's only a database update, you've already anchored people in terms of what you think that is. And they are going to lock onto that, stick to it, even if they don't necessarily think that the task at hand is that small or only something or just something. So it's quite important to be very, very careful of the language that you use when you are even using techniques like planning poker. And I guess in terms of debiasing for anchoring and for anchoring adjustment, overall, what I'd actually recommend is that you try and move away from expert-based estimation. So where you're asking people to make an estimate on something, it's very, very hard for them to get rid of this type of bias. What we can use is what's called model-based estimation, where you use a mathematical model to actually generate an estimate. And, probably can't see that from the back. I would highly, highly recommend the work of Troy McGuinness. Troy is an Australian who currently lives in Seattle, works for a company or founded a company called Focused Objective. And I would highly recommend that you watch, read, listen, and follow everything that Troy McGuinness talks about. Go to focusedobjective.com to read through that. He has spreadsheets and existing templates that you can use to get started in this kind of model-based estimation. So anchoring in its original form referenced or was based on kind of numeric values, but we can also anchor on other ideas as well, and we can get pretty fixed in those. One of the things that we've seen in academic research around cognitive biases in software estimation is that particularly with new or inexperienced developers, when they're coming onto a project, they will have a pretty poor understanding of the actual solution itself. They'll have a very limited view of what's in there. And because of that, they will actually anchor on their understanding of it. So that can lead to, I guess, kind of poorly implemented changes. It can lead to them not really understanding how they need to change the application and can introduce bugs as well. The other area that we see is in system designers. So this is usually people with the architect title or architect somewhere in their title. No offense to them. Sorry. So system designers, as I'm sure you're aware, can be pretty, precious about what they've kind of come up with. And they will anchor on their original design pretty hard. And there's a few other kind of biases which we'll get onto that feed into that as well. And it can be very, very difficult to de-bias for that, to kind of get them out of thinking. But explicitly asking them to generate alternatives, and then potentially even using something like a model-based comparison, where you're not asking for people's subjective opinion on them, that can help to de-bias them. The other option is to democratize those decisions. So rather than having one person making a decision about your architecture and having all of that one person's biases kind of feed into that, you can ask the team. I'm going to jump on to the next bias. If you've read Thinking Fast and Slow, you'll recognize these two, and they're covered pretty extensively in that. Availability bias is the tendency for easy to recall information to unduly influence perceptions or judgments. So within the academic research, there's pretty strong evidence about that developers will only search documentation that's easy to access for them. And two, they'll rely on prior knowledge or experience to figure out what documentation they need to go and look at. So I know we have Google and Stack Overflow, and it's saved all of our lives many times. But our reliance on that and a kind of a tendency to go and search in certain areas does itself introduce a bias in terms of when we're trying to find solution things. So this can sometimes result in inefficient searches. Developers don't really know where to go to be able to access the information they need. Another effect is associated with preferring a familiar but less suitable programming language. Who's ever experienced that? Okay, a few. What's available to us is the language that we know, so we are absolutely going to prefer that. And the bias in it is that we'll convince ourselves that it is the right language for the job when it may not necessarily be. JavaScript, maybe? And we also see the availability bias manifest within project-based organizations, so organizations that tend to run in projects. And this is where they'll fail to learn the lessons from kind of previous projects. So where they've completed a project, they'll make the same mistakes kind of again and again because they don't really have access to the information to learn from the previous projects that they've done. So in terms of debiasing for availability, it is pretty difficult again. It's one of those tougher ones. Participatory, Jesus, that was a tough one. Participatory decision-making, so getting the team involved in decision-making can help with that. Retrospective meetings, whether you're doing Scrum or not, retrospectives are always a great idea. Having a point where you can kind of look back at what's happened in the project or look back at the decisions you made gives you a much better chance of debiasing from that and actually being able to stop making that mistake. Including people from outside the teams in those retrospectives as well is a very, very good tactic and does give pretty good results from what I've seen in practice as well. And particularly around, in terms of directing developers to documentation, one technique I've had really good success with recently is building pretty good kind of roll-on documentation for new people in the team. So rather than them having to kind of dig around within the source code or try and, do I go to Confluence? Do I go to SharePoint? Is it in someone's file share somewhere? Instead, you give them a comprehensive roll-on document that tells them where to go exactly for what kind of information that they'll need. That helps to alleviate it too. Jumping on. Framing and kind of closely associated fixation is a tendency to disproportionately kind of focus on one aspect of a situation, object or event, and particularly impose kind of self-imagined barriers on that as well. So I'm going to give you a story of a bit of an extreme example of fixation and framing in a way as well. This is a book cover from a book published back in I think it was the 80s, about a plane crash, if you can't see it. This is slightly dramatized, but not really too much. This was United Flight 173. So They were flying from Denver in the United States to Portland. Pretty routine flight. They'd already completed a leg, I think, from New York. And as they were coming into land, they deployed their landing gear. Now, unfortunately, one of the components of the landing gear, a pneumatic tube, exploded. It didn't stop the landing gear from deploying properly, so the wheels were down, but it did sever the sensor to the landing gear. So as far as the pilot, the co-pilot, and the flight engineer were concerned, they couldn't tell if their wheel was down. Now, most of you probably fly quite regularly. You'll know the wheels are kind of underneath the wings, so you can't even see. There's no way to kind of look out into it. So they were in a pretty tricky situation. And how they reacted, they radioed the airport where they were landing in Portland, let them know that it was emergency, and they were put into what's called a holding pattern. So they moved away from the airport and just started circling while they tried to resolve the problem. So the captain sent the first officer out to look on the wing. There is a little indicator on the wing that shows when the gear is down, but he wasn't able to see it. And in this time, it took about kind of half an hour for all this. The flight engineer noticed that they had about 4,000 pounds, that's US pounds, of fuel left. Now that's nothing in kind of airplane terms. That's, you need to be getting in and landing on that. But the captain was so fixated on solving the problem with the landing gear that he didn't really hear the information. The way they put it in the incident report afterwards was that he forgot to fly the plane. The captain forgot to fly the plane. After another rotation, another circle in this holding pattern, it really started to come to a head. They kind of knew that they needed to get down. They finally realized that they'd made a huge, huge mistake on this, and they started to land, or started to prepare to land. Now, there was no way they could reach the airport at this stage. There was no other airfield within close proximity, but they did spot a dark area that they thought they could potentially land in. Unfortunately, or maybe somewhat fortunately, that dark area was just a group of houses that happened to have their lights off. So they landed in between two houses and destroyed two houses. The entire front of the plane was destroyed as well. The captain did survive, and so did the flight crew. Unfortunately, 10 people died in that accident. Now, that is an extreme, extreme example, but if you think about it, I think we all can be a little guilty of fixating on things so much that we actually forget to kind of fly our own plane as well. That kind of fixation is the thing that causes people to delete databases in production, or to delete Google Calendar. I feel so bad, whoever did that a couple of days back. But that's what happens. And it is an information kind of overload in terms of what we're doing. So to cope with it, we'll actually fixate on a particular thing, and we'll frame it in a particular way so that we're able to kind of make sense on it, and we're able to kind of move ahead with it. One example I saw recently in terms of framing a fixation, I was working with a DevOps team, I air quote because I think the idea of a separate DevOps team that's a different talk. They were supporting a team supporting over 200 development teams. And their work management system, Azure DevOps, if you're interested, they actually used a single team project to keep all of those teams in, to manage all the work. That led to these massive pages of boards that people in those teams had to kind of scroll through to find their own. So over 200 of them, so they're like scrolling for ages to try and find the board that you're using. The reason why they chose that structure was because they wanted to be able to do reporting. So keeping them all in one team project made it easier for them to report. It made their 200 developers teams' lives shit, but they were cool with it because they needed to do reporting, So they're changing that anyway after the discussions that I've had with them. And I hope it didn't scare anyone about flying. Flying is incredibly safe. That was back in 1970 odd. But the reason why I told that 173 story is what actually happened after it. So after that incident, everyone felt incredibly sorry for the captain. No one really, he was blamed. He did lose his job, so he was blamed in that way. But within the industry, most people just feel like he was very, very unlucky. He kind of just got into a very bad situation, and just focused on it too much and missed out, just forgot to fly the plane. What was implemented after that was what in the aviation industry they call crew resource management, so CRM, another CRM. And CRM training was focused on teaching captains how to delegate responsibilities appropriately. And most importantly, delegating the responsibility of who is flying the plane while we deal with this. So it would have been an obvious solution for the problems that they had. They also teach the first and second officers to speak up when they're concerned. Even introducing kind of formulaic openers, like templates that they can use to be able to talk to the captain and say, I think there is a problem. They also taught them that sometimes the captain doesn't necessarily know better, and when the safety of the aircraft is at stake, that they should take control of the plane. So I think we can all definitely learn from that kind of crew resource management. And I have seen this start to become more prevalent in teams. I'm not sure if Donovan talked about it in terms of what Microsoft do in their live site teams and their responses. But site reliability engineering teams will often have an incident response team, and they have this kind of delegation, a very crew resource management type approach to it. Within our project teams and within our normal work as well, it's very important that we have that capability too, and that we are able to delegate those tasks, and we have someone who is focused on remembering to fly the plane to actually help us deliver something of value. Cool. So, the second conundrum that Buster identified was not enough meaning. So given all of the information that we have, or that we have to process, we then have to filter that out, kind of keep something or keep some things and not others, but we need to be able to build meaning from that, to be able to, I guess, kind of improve our understanding. And with that, we tend to find stories and patterns, even when we're looking at sparse data. We can tell ourselves incredible stories about things that we know very little about. We fill in characteristics from stereotypes, generalities, and previous histories. So we will fill in those gaps with things that we kind of have known previously. Again, elaborating on the story that we're telling ourselves. We imagine things and people we're familiar or fond with as better. I think we'd all kind of agree with that. We simplify probabilities and numbers to make them easier to think about. We don't just simplify probabilities, we are terrible at probabilities. We are like so bad at probabilities. It's just a natural thing. And the last one there, we think we know what other people are thinking. So, going to jump into one in particular, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, not invented here. This is a general cognitive bias in that it actually does affect the wider world as well. It's not just a software development thing. Typically there, it's where people will refuse to buy from another country. Like Norway won't buy from Sweden. Is that the kind of, yeah. Within software development, we're familiar with it. We actually call it not invented here syndrome. So where we have our own kind of name for it. And it's a tendency towards reinventing the wheel, re-implementing something that's kind of already available. Has anyone ever built a kind of a CRM system? Yeah, bespoke CRM system. We've all done it. And it is kind of based on the belief that there's a few different reasons for it, I suppose, but typically it's that they believe the in-house development will be better, might be more easily maintainable, maybe kind of more secure or more controlled. And often people think that it's going to be easier to maintain, and that kind of thinking I think that's an actual fallacy that we should probably investigate. Because every bit of code that we write always costs in maintenance, whereas a product that we buy is someone else's problem. And that's why the cloud's so cool, you know? It's Microsoft or Amazon's problem now, not ours. And one of the things that I see really commonly is people writing their own authentication. I cannot tell you how much of a bad idea that is. The argument that I get from people is that, oh, well, you know, we don't want to use someone else's, or you know, we know that it's going to be more secure because we control it. And what I always say to that is that if you think your security team is better than Microsoft or Amazon's, you are deluding yourself in terms of that. So please don't write your own authentication. One of the other debiasing techniques that I take with this, particularly where teams are trying to make that decision of, do we buy something or do we build it ourselves, is to move to a model-based kind of approach for that. Actually getting them to forecast or estimate how much they think both will take will help them to start to think about that and help them to start to be able to figure that out. One of the things that you do need to factor in is the lifetime maintenance of things. It's a very easy kind of trap to fall into, thinking that we're going to build this for cheaper than it would to buy it, especially where you're paying millions of dollars for products like SAP or some of those enterprise softwares. But the money that you're going to spend in terms of maintaining that and the cost of delay that is going to incur on everything else that you could potentially do needs to be factored into it as well. Troy McGinnis, again, has some really, really good stuff around this that can help you to kind of factor these things out and debias some of these decisions. But moving on. This is a tough one to say. So the extrinsic incentive bias is a tendency for people to attribute relatively more to extrinsic incentives, so that's things like kind of monetary rewards, than to intrinsic incentives, such as kind of learning a new skill. It's like I'm back in speech therapy again. This is crazy. And it's specifically when weighing the motives of others. So I'll give you a bit of an example of that to make it a bit clearer. A study was done on MBA students, I think in Cornell. They were asked to rank the job motivations of Citibank customer service representatives. These are frontline people on phones answering queries from bank customers. And this is what they came up with. So probably worth calling out there is the amount of pay was the first one. So they thought that the single biggest motivator for customer service representatives was the amount of money they were paid. Down below that was having job security, kind of basic needs. Quality of fringe benefits, amount of praise from your supervisor, like a pat on the head will make everything better. Doing something that makes you feel good about yourself. Developing skills and abilities came all the way in down at 6th. So, in the study, they then asked the actual customer service representatives what their real motivators were. And they said completely the opposite. So the first one was developing skills and abilities. Second one was accomplishing something worthwhile. We all want to feel like we're doing something. Amount of pay came 7th, if you can't see it down the back there. And the amount of praise from your supervisor came last, funnily enough, which I do think was interesting. And now you might be a bit cynical and say, well, this is what they say motivates them, but maybe that's not what actually motivates them. But we do have information from a lot of exit interviews which backs up this result. These are really the things that motivate people. People will stay in a not so nice environment where they are accomplishing something worthwhile. Anyone who's ever volunteered for anything can tell you that. And Dan Pink's Drive is an incredible book about this. I would highly, highly recommend it if you haven't read it. Covers a lot of this, kind of what motivates us to do the work that we do. There is some interesting stuff as well around what's called a backfire effect, and it is another kind of bias as well, where people are asked to, or are offered an extrinsic incentive, so where they're offered money to do a job that would normally be motivated by the other one, they'll actually perform worse. So people will do worse. So if I offered you money to, like more money to write software, you will eventually, there might be a bit of a peak at the start, but you'll eventually start performing worse than you would have had I not. So that backfire effect is a very, very important one to watch out for. The recommendation from the study on this was to, if you are trying to think about other people's motivations, that you focus on your own. So rather than you saying, what do I think that person's motivations are, just ask, what are my motivations? And use that to help yourself rank that. Obviously within software development, where this kind of comes into play sometimes is when we start thinking about, obviously, our teams as leaders, but also our end users. So where we're trying to design a system for end users, and trying to imagine what their motivations are going to be, don't think of them that way. Just think of you as a user. And the way that you can debias that is by asking a larger group of people, either a representative group of people or a diverse group of people, much more preferably. Cool. Oh, sorry, that was we had to do a bit of a rotation change. So hindsight bias is the last one in this section that we'll look at. And hindsight is the tendency to regard outcomes of having been predictable all along. There's a phrase in English called hindsight is 20/20. So 20/20 is like perfect vision. So you always have perfect vision when you're looking back at previous things. And within software development, I've experienced this most when people are looking back at project failures. So I've seen people look at things that there was no way it was predictable, but they are convinced that, if we'd just done some kind of more investigation or just understood things a bit better, that we would have been able to predict it and would have been able to account for it. This just doesn't work. Something that we use in Redify, the company that I work for in Australia, is what we call a kickoff deck. So this is an example of the kind of first slide that we use where we're trying to get everyone on the same page. And what we experience is that most of the time, even within a company, people have very different ideas about what they're doing, and we're trying to get them all to agree on one thing. But within that kickoff, we will also agree what the vision for the project is, or the engagement is, what the objectives of it is, and most importantly, really, what the risks are. We have that then as a document, and we share it with everyone on the project team. Everyone gets it from the customer and from within our teams as well. And we're able to then look back at that. So when we come to the end of a project and we're doing a project retrospective, we have the original agreed risks. During the project, we also report on these risks and objectives and opportunities as well that we're doing in a weekly email that we send out to all of our company. So we have a full traceability through the project of where these risks occurred. That way, at the end of the project, if something does go wrong, we're able to look back and say, well, yes, maybe someone did see the risk, maybe we didn't react to it appropriately. And we can actually learn from that. And that's a very, very good way of debiasing for that hindsight risk. The kind of effect of the hindsight bias is that people tend to lose faith in kind of things that they've done before, or lose faith in people. When you think that they could have done more to be able to fix it, you have a tendency to kind of blame that on them, when a lot of the times it wasn't really their fault. And, whoa, okay, too late. Spoilers. So, has anyone heard of black swan theory? A few people down the back, yeah, cool. So this is a black swan. Surprise. The phrase black swan actually it's a very, very old phrase. The first noted, I think, was in Latin, so it was really old if it was in Latin. And originally what it meant was that something that was impossible, because every European at the time had only ever seen white swans. Then, one day in 1697, a Dutch explorer, and I'm going to butcher this name, Willem de Vlaming, I got it, that was pretty good, sailed into Perth, where I live, and saw these little guys swimming around on what is now called the Swan River. And that changed the meaning of the phrase entirely, from something that was impossible to something that people thought was impossible. Was quite hard to predict, but maybe in hindsight, we could have kind of predicted it. And black swan theory now is a bit of the study of that. And there's some interesting things that have happened, I guess, in the technology world that you could call black swan events. I don't think anyone really saw how big the web was going to be, how much it was going to change the world. I think a few people did, but not many. And even things like Google. I don't think anyone, especially Yahoo, didn't see what Google were going to do. They really, really wish they had. But yeah, there are things that happen there. Black swan theory is incredibly interesting to look at in terms of how do you try and predict things that happen or that will literally change the world. How do you kind of try and foresee those? Right, so moving on to the third section. I'm still good for time. The third conundrum is that we need to act fast. So with all of the information that we've had, everything that we've pulled together, the meaning that we've created from it, we now need to make decisions. If we are lost in an analysis paralysis or trying to figure everything out, we'll never get anything done. We'll never be able to act quickly and get things there. So the kind of biases that we see around this are that we favor simple-looking options and complete information over complex and ambiguous options. To avoid mistakes, we aim to preserve autonomy and group status and avoid inevitable decisions, or irreversible decisions, sorry. To get things done, we tend to complete things we've invested time and energy in. And to stay focused, we favor the immediate relatable thing in front of us. And last one there, to act, we must be as confident we can make an impact and feel what we do is important. So there's a few things within there that I'd like to kind of explore in a bit more detail. And the first one is that last one, overconfidence bias. Has anyone ever met an overconfident developer? Is anyone willing to admit that they have been an overconfident developer? Thank you. So overconfidence bias is the tendency to overestimate one's skills and abilities. There's actually been quite a bit of academic research on cognitive biases, specifically in software development, around this. So someone thought it was enough of a problem to actually spend time investigating it, which should tell us something about what we do. Within software development, the way it manifests is, and what the academic research found was that there is a tendency to produce overly optimistic estimates, judgments, and predictions. Surprise. They found some interesting things too, which you may or may not like to hear, that technical roles, so developers, appear to be more optimistic than non-technical roles like managers. So your manager is better at estimating than you are. At least in this particular study, it was in web development tasks that they found that in. But the real implication is that it's knowing more about specific kind of tasks can actually lead to less accuracy in terms of forecasting or estimation. One study as well suggests that overconfidence leads professionals to neglect requirements analysis, leading to kind of a superficial understanding of the problem. So they're kind of so confident in their abilities of what the solution is that they don't really invest too much time kind of investigating it properly. And I'm going to talk to project managers. Project managers often are overconfident in time and resource estimation and can lead to outright project failure. I don't think any of us are really surprised at that. But overconfidence doesn't generally kind of operate on its own. There's usually some other factors which come into play as well. Confirmation bias is one that particularly hits in terms of, and anchoring bias as well, in terms of like giving us a poor understanding of what it is that we're trying to do. In terms of how we kind of debias for overconfidence, it is pretty difficult to tell overconfident people to be less confident. But what we can do is use what's called directed questions to attempt to elicit information from them, like using schemes or checklists, like in aviation CRM. We'll have like particular kind of questions that we can ask people. And encouraging individuals and also organizations to engage in self-reflection. So that kind of retrospective process, making that an organizational-wide thing can definitely help with that. Around estimation and overconfidence in estimation, there was an interesting result that even how you phrase questions can change the kind of output that you get from people. Specifically asking how much effort is required to complete X versus asking how much can be completed in Y work hours. The previous one gave much more kind of much more overconfident kind of results than the latter. So effectively kind of focusing on tasks rather than on time is a very good debiasing technique for overconfidence within there. Somewhat related to that, and something you may have heard of before, is what's called the Dunning-Kruger effect. And this is something we're all subjected to. It's particularly problematic when you first learn. So what Dunning and Kruger were two research scientists. What they discovered was that people mistakenly assess cognitive ability as greater than it is. And this is kind of related to another one which is a bit further up there called illusory superiority, where you kind of think you're better than everyone else. And the kind of corollary of this is that competent students, so while incompetent people overestimate how good they are, competent students actually underestimate how good they are. So the incompetent don't think they're better than the competent, but the competent don't know how good they are. Yeah, that was right. But illusory superiority comes from the kind of the internal illusion in people of low ability, and from like an external misrepresentation of high ability. So they don't really understand kind of how incompetent they are. Does that make sense? So they're incompetently incompetent. You may have heard of that phrase before. And I think it was Kruger actually said, if you're incompetent, you can't know you're incompetent. The skills you need to produce a right answer are exactly the skills that you need to recognize what the right answer is. I think that kind of sums it up quite well. Incompetent students, though, in the study that they did improve their ability to estimate their rank correctly after receiving minimal tutoring in skills that they previously lacked. So when they were kind of told about the skills that they didn't have, they were able to kind of realize that they were still missing some things. In software development, I don't know if you'd agree, I think I see this quite a lot. And the main areas when I see it is actually when we're dealing with other kind of departments. So I work a lot with salespeople. I work a lot with kind of project management or delivery management as well. And I do think there is a bit of a pervasive kind of idea within software teams, because we're kind of smart people, I think that we think we know a bit more about kind of what they do than we really do. I think we're in the Dunning-Kruger effect scale. I think we're in the I know everything about what everyone else does. Not sure if you agree? Maybe? The problem with it is, and the problem with the Dunning-Kruger effect is that the people that you deal with know that you're not good enough. In universities, where you're kind of, you know, when you first start in university, you've got like a semester or two of something, and I'm going to tell this lecturer, you know, I'm going to tell my professor what's all about this stuff. That kind of overconfidence, they're happy to deal with that because they have to deal with it all the time. When you're dealing with people in business, you just come across as an asshole. So that is the kind of the effect that we're putting out on people, in that we think that we could do their job better than them. And it hurts us too as well. Like I've seen people move from, particularly into kind of like leadership, where developers will move into leadership thinking that they know everything that they need to know about leading, and they fail really hard, and it's not a good outcome for anyone. Certainly not for them, because it's hard to take that step back. Interestingly, for the ladies in the room, on average, men overestimate their abilities by 30%, women only by 15%. So you're a little better at kind of judging your own abilities in there. You're not really surprised at that. And interestingly, socioeconomics actually come into it too. Individuals of relatively high socioeconomic social class are generally more overconfident than lower economic class. There's kind of cultural forces within there too. It tends to change within regions or areas. Debiasing for this, again, it's a tough one because it's a very internal thing for people. But debiasing for this kind of mentality within your team, I think diversity is one of the best ways to do that. So hiring people with much more, or from diverse backgrounds will give you a kind of a better blend of people to approach this. Skipping up, appeal to novelty. I'm actually just not going to say anything. I'm just going to show you this. JavaScript frameworks. So the appeal to novelty is actually a fallacy. It's not specifically a bias with itself. And the fallacy is prematurely claiming that an idea or proposal is correct or superior exclusively because it's new or modern. So there's nothing wrong with novelty. Novelty is perfectly fine. But when you kind of say that something is better because it's new, that's the fallacy that we're kind of talking about. And it usually takes two forms. It's either overestimating the new or modern or underestimating the status quo, the kind of what was there previously. And it may be that investigation kind of proves it true in the future, but the fallacy itself is that where you just assume it automatically. And there's a very interesting kind of history of this within our industry. When it kind of, the first dot-com boom back in the 90s, has anyone watched Valley of the Boom from HBO? I watched it on the plane over. I liked the whole series because I flew from that far away. It was really, really super interesting. It kind of covered that start from when Netscape's first kind of IPO and things exploded. And that whole first dot-com boom was based off this fallacy. It got like super, super crazy. Companies that didn't even have a website were putting .com on the end of their name, and their stock price was going up because of it. Like that, it was batshit. And it was because people believed this. They were like, oh, it's new, it must be better. So, let's do it. One of the things I've seen in particular in software is where people will latch on to a new framework. I had a colleague who asked me for a bit of advice around what mobile framework they should use. Now, the team that he was working with had been through two, I wouldn't say they were bad, they were good projects, they delivered value out of them. They had a lot of problems with a thing called Xamarin Forms, which is Microsoft's kind of cross-platform mobile development framework. And they were kind of a bit sick of it, So he was asking me about, should we go to React Native? And I asked him, have you used it? Have you tried it out? And he said, I've had a play with it, which is developer speak for I've read a blog post. And I said, listen, dude, it's kind of up to you and the team. I'm not going to tell you one way or the other. You do know Xamarin, you know where your problems are going to be. So he went away, and they made a decision, and 3 months later, he came back and said to me, I should have used Xamarin. So they had like 3 months of problems. And that's, well, I think that kind of leads to the debiasing for this particular one, is that you need to investigate these things first. You should not just invest in something new because it's new. Where I'd argue against that in terms of novelty is where you're in a situation where you have kind of continuous decay. So if you're maintaining a VB6 app, if you have to do that, it's probably worth getting off that. It's probably worth just saying, yes, let's go for the novelty and get away from it. But try not to do it where it's not necessary. Moving up ever so slightly, the sunk cost fallacy. Who's heard of the sunk cost fallacy before? Yes, everyone. It's a tendency to rationally invest more resources in a situation in which prior investment has been made, as compared to a similar situation in which a prior investment has not been made. So let me give you an example. So let's say I'm a government department for, let's go with Sweden. And I've got a project for an application that I'm trying to build, and it's gone out to tender, and the winning bid was $40 million. We get to about a year later with the projected kind of delivery date. Application still isn't there, and the team or the vendor that I went with tell me that it's going to cost them another $100 million to be able to deliver it. If I agree to that, I have fallen prey to the sunk cost fallacy. And if you think about it, at the very start, had that government department in Sweden been told that the project was going to cost $100 million, they would have said, absolutely no way. If they'd been told it was going to cost $140 million, they would have said, not a chance. So that's the fallacy that's involved there. I would have used knock, but I cannot figure out how that works with the comma. In game theory, this is known as the Concorde fallacy. You might be getting an aviation theme, bit of an aviation nerd. Concorde was I think the first and still the only commercial supersonic jet. It was operated by funded by the British and French government. Internally, the British government admitted that it should never have happened. It was a huge, huge costly mistake for them, but for political reasons, they kind of had to do it. And this bias is somewhat related to one a couple above, what's called the escalation of commitment. Escalation of commitment is what happens after the kind of the sunk cost fallacy, where you've made that decision. And there's been a lot of work done on escalation of commitment, specifically within kind of behavioral economics. And it's kind of explained in three elements. So firstly, the situation has to have cost something time or effort. The time has passed, and it's led to a kind of an apex moment where a decision on this has to be made. And this problem is now forcing a decision maker, and it's usually one person. What happens is everyone's kind of, it's all one team until someone has to make a decision, and everyone else steps back, and that person's left kind of up front kind of to make the decision. And they have to kind of weigh things up, like, do they add more cost or do they cancel it? And the single thing that matters most to people in that situation isn't actually the cost. They'll factor it in, but other biases will kind of kick in. What's actually important to them is whether or not people think they were making the right decision. So they care more about what people think than what the actual cost is. So you could potentially debias for this type of thing by looking at cost models, kind of saying, is it worth carrying on? You could kind of say, what's the value that this project is going to deliver for us? In that example, if we knew that it was going to save us $10 million a year in effort, would I carry on if it was 140? It's going to be 15 years before it will repay its value. Probably not. I'd hope not. But if people think that they should carry on for political reasons like the Concorde, they might, The better thing, I think, to debias it is to have people who are willing to speak up and say, no, like, I think you should cancel it. I agree with you that if you cancel it, it's making the right decision, because that's the thing that affects the person's decision most. So that's, we see that a lot in kind of agile teams, and people talk about that a lot in agile teams, that they're empowered, that they have that capability, that it's not just one person making the decision, it's a team's decision, and they have the support of each other to be able to do that. And really, really most importantly, they have the psychological safety to be able to do that within their teams. Okay, jumping on, last section. So, what should we remember? Now, there's not really a lot I'm going to cover in this, because these areas are really more focused on the kind of individual. We do store memories differently based on how they're experienced. We'll look at kind of part of that. We reduce events and lists their key elements. We discard specifics to form generalities. We edit and reinforce the memories after the fact. You should not trust your own memory. If you've talked to people about something that's happened and they remember it very, very differently to you, they're not wrong. You're just both wrong. Nobody's got the right memory. It's all colored by our biases and by what we've kind of learned and experienced. The first one I want to jump into is one that I do see a lot of. It's negativity bias. We remember the negatives far, far more than the positives. If you've ever spoken and you get some negative feedback, you will remember that way, way more than any positive feedback that people can give you. It just sticks out, and it stays in your memory a hell of a lot longer as well. And this counts in general for everything that we do. We always remember the negatives. From an evolutionary kind of standpoint, it kind of makes sense. If you make a mistake out in the, when we were cave people, it meant getting eaten by a saber-toothed tiger, So we had to learn from the negatives much more quickly and remember them much harder than the positives. The areas that I see it in software development are particularly in things like technologies. So in my example, my colleague who hated Xamarin Forms, he really remembered the negatives of that. He didn't remember that he delivered, well, he remembered, but it wasn't at the forefront that he delivered 2 successful projects with it. He just remembered that it was a bit painful, And it really was just a bit painful. It didn't stop them from delivering what they needed to deliver. But those negative memories just stuck with him. And we do have a tendency to abandon kind of technologies as well because of this focus on negativity within there. And I've also seen it with, and this is quite disturbing for me as well, is with people in the industry, where if someone's had a negative experience with someone in the past, that they will remember that negative experience more, and it'll actually affect whether or not they will hire them. I had an incident recently where someone said, we had a potential candidate, and someone in our team said, oh, I worked with him before, and he's not the nicest guy. So that's a very kind of broad statement to make, because it was a few years before that they'd had this incident with them. It could have just been a personality clash, but it was affecting this person's ability, potentially, to get a job. So that kind of negativity bias it's something that really we can only debias by kind of helping each other out. We're very good at spotting these biases in each other, so we kind of need each other to point it out and call it out and say, hey, maybe you're being a bit negative. Someone did that in our team, and we did actually hire that guy. We didn't hire him, or sorry, we did interview that guy. We didn't hire him, though, in the end, for different reasons. But that negativity is something that we need to kind of stop doing. Okay, and I'm about to potentially open a little bit of a can of worms for being this early in the morning, with a few minutes left. I want to talk about what in cognitive biases we call prejudice, and this includes prejudice against sex, gender, age, nationality, ethnicity. I don't want to browbeat people, but I think it would be remiss of me to not talk about this kind of bias in a talk about biases. And prejudice, as defined, is an unfavorable feeling towards a person or thing prior to or not based on actual experience. And this area is really well studied within social psychology in particular. And it kind of hangs off two things. They're actually over on the other side of this. One's called in-group favoritism, and the other is the opposite, out-group negativity. And they're actually separated very explicitly by social psychologists, because they have different kind of effects. In-group is where we have a tendency to prefer people within our own group. Out-group is where we kind of think of people kind of outside our group as we kind of give them, we think of them having to have to do more to be kind of considered part of our team, I guess, or tribe, you know? And what they found there in those areas is that men tend to have actually an ethnic favoritism. So given that we're in an industry dominated by white men, we're probably not going to be surprised by that. But there is a real bias there in place that we will prefer our own kind of ethnic identity, more so than women. So women are actually better at kind of accepting other ethnicities than men are. And what I take from that is that by hiring more women, you'll actually kind of help to open yourself up as a team or as an organization to more ethnicities within there. And that mentality will move through the team as well, help them to kind of form that information. Interestingly, the women actually have a strong gender bias for that in-group favoritism, more so than men. It's like 4.5 times stronger than men. So women will prefer to stay with other women, 4.5 times more than men will stay to prefer with kind of other men. The effect that I've seen that have is that when you are trying to hire women, when you are trying to improve your gender diversity within your organization, unless you already have women there, it's very, very difficult to convince them to come on. I'm lucky in that I have a Donna Edwards, whose talk is 2 slots down for me. You should go listen to it about building better teams. She was able to help build that, and I'd highly recommend that you go listen to that talk if that is an area that you need help within. Cool. But yeah, I guess the kind of point of this, I guess, from the reason why I wanted to talk about this prejudice is that I do really, really think, and I hope you've kind of gathered from the previous stuff that I've talked through, that the best way to debias for a lot of these things is to have that kind of diversity of gender, to have that kind of diversity of ethnicity and background, and even diversity of thought, because that's really the only way that we're all going to get better at this. So that completes our little trek around the Codex. I hope it's given you some insight. I hope you're inspired to investigate more in it. You can Google this, Cognitive Bias Codex. If you grab the SVG, they all actually link through to the relevant Wikipedia article. You can investigate it more there. I would caution you, though, as with any knowledge, just be careful of it. You know, make sure you understand it. Remember the Dunning-Kruger effect before you go accusing your boss of illusory superiority. But if you do investigate, or you do have any stories that you think would be interesting, I'd love to hear them. My contact details again, with my LinkedIn at the bottom there. And I do have stickers down here, lots of stickers. There's a No Drama Llama, and Corns having a beer. So if you want to grab them, feel free. Come ask me any questions or ping me on that. Thank you all very much for your time. Have a great day.